At its absolute peak, a single pound of nutmeg was worth more than 7 cows. Let that sink in for a moment. A tiny handful of dried seeds, small enough to fit in your palm, was considered more valuable than an entire livestock. People were enslaved, nations were conquered, and wars were fought not over gold, not over land, but over the contents of a spice jar. The spice trade is one of the most brutal, fascinating, and consequential economic stories in all of human history. And most people have no idea it ever happened. In the next 10 minutes, you are going to discover how the desire for flavor literally redrew the map of the world. We will cover which spices were so valuable they functioned as currency, how the hunt for pepper and cinnamon accidentally produced the age of exploration, and why the tiny island of Run, a place most people have never heard of, was once considered more valuable than Manhattan. The most counterintuitive part of this whole story is just how recent it all was. These are not ancient myths. This is the origin story of the modern world. To understand why spices became so powerful, you have to go back to medieval Europe. This was a world without refrigeration, without preservatives, and without reliable ways to keep food from rotting. Meat spoiled within days. Winter diets were monotonous, salted, and barely palatable. Then traders began arriving with strange powders and dried seeds from distant lands, substances that could mask the taste of decay, preserve food for longer, and transform an ordinary meal into something extraordinary. Suddenly, the wealthy class had access to flavor that the common person could not even dream of. Spices became a symbol of status, sophistication, and power. But here is what nobody talks about when they tell this story. The demand for spices was not just about food. Medieval Europeans believed deeply in the medicinal and even spiritual properties of spices. Pepper was thought to cure digestive illness. Cinnamon was believed to treat respiratory problems. Cloves were used as a dental painkiller that actually worked, because clove oil genuinely contains eugenol, a natural anesthetic. Nutmeg was considered a protection against the plague. When your world is constantly threatened by disease and death, any substance that promises relief becomes almost priceless. Spices occupied a space somewhere between food, medicine, and magic. The overland routes that brought spices from Asia to Europe were among the most complex trading networks ever assembled. Arab merchants controlled the critical middle legs of these journeys, buying from Indian traders and selling to Venetian and Genoese middlemen at enormous markups. By the time a single pound of pepper reached a market in London or Paris, it had passed through a dozen hands and its price had multiplied tenfold. The Arab traders were deliberately secretive about where the spices came from. They told elaborate myths that cinnamon was harvested from giant bird nests, that cassia grew in shallow lakes guarded by winged creatures, all to prevent Europeans from even dreaming of going directly to the source. This secrecy, combined with the explosion in demand, is what ultimately drove the age of exploration. The Portuguese were the first to crack the puzzle. Prince Henry the Navigator funded decades of careful coastal exploration down the African continent. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and arrived in Calicut, India. When the Indian merchants asked what he wanted, he reportedly said simply, "Christians and spices." The Portuguese had broken the Arab monopoly, and the world would never be the same again. The profits were staggering. Da Gama's first voyage returned a cargo of pepper and cinnamon that earned 60 times its cost. 60 times. In a single voyage. Within years, Portugal had established a seaborne empire of trading posts stretching from Lisbon to Goa to Malacca to the Moluccas, the fabled Spice Islands in what is now eastern Indonesia. They did not do this gently. They bombarded cities, massacred Arab trading fleets, and imposed a licensing system where any ship that sailed without a Portuguese permit could be sunk on sight. The spice trade had officially entered its most violent chapter. Spain, watching Portugal grow obscenely rich, funded a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus to find a western route to the Spice Islands. He failed in that specific goal. The Caribbean islands he reached had no pepper, no cloves, no nutmeg. But the accident of that failure was the discovery of the Americas. Think about that. The entire colonization of the Western Hemisphere was a side effect of someone looking for a shortcut to a better seasoning route. Millions of lives, entire civilizations, centuries of history all set in motion by the search for spice. The Dutch arrived on the scene in the late 1500s and proved to be even more ruthless than the Portuguese. They formed the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indisch Company, in 1602, which became the most valuable corporation in history. At its peak, the VOC was worth approximately 78 million Dutch guilders, which in today's money translates to somewhere between $4 and $8 trillion. It employed over 50,000 people, maintained its own private army, could declare war, execute prisoners, and negotiate treaties. It was essentially a nation-state disguised as a company, and it was built almost entirely on the spice trade. The Dutch did something particularly calculated and cold-blooded. They pursued a policy of monopoly enforcement so extreme it bordered on genocide. On the Banda Islands, the primary source of nutmeg in the entire world, the Dutch governor Jan Pieterszoon Cohen ordered the massacre of virtually the entire native population, an estimated 15,000 people, because they refused to honor Dutch trading exclusivity. The islands were then repopulated with Dutch colonists and enslaved workers. The nutmeg trees were counted and controlled. A global spice cartel had been established through extermination. But here is where the story takes one of its most fascinating turns. The Dutch controlled all the major spice islands except one. That island was run a tiny strip of land barely 3 miles long, sitting in the Banda Sea. The English held it. And the Dutch desperately wanted it because a single competitor could undermine their entire monopoly. After years of conflict, in 1667 the two nations signed the Treaty of Breda. The Dutch gave the English the island of Manhattan in exchange for Run. They genuinely believed they were getting the better deal. Manhattan, after all, was just a forested trading post. Run had nutmeg trees. The irony of that trade defines the entire arc of the spice trade's decline. Within a generation, the French had smuggled nutmeg seedlings out of the Dutch-controlled islands and transplanted them to Mauritius and Grenada. The Dutch monopoly collapsed. When a spice can be grown anywhere in the tropics, it loses its geographic scarcity. And without scarcity, the astronomical prices evaporate. By the 1800s, nutmeg was cheap enough for ordinary households to own. The entire geopolitical system that had been built around controlling it simply ceased to matter. What the spice trade left behind is far more complex than the spices themselves. It established the template for global capitalism, the joint stock corporation, the colonial trading post, the idea of a company operating across sovereign borders with state-level power. It created the sea routes that would later carry enslaved people, cotton, sugar, and manufactured goods. It drew the colonial boundaries across Asia, Africa, and the Americas that still cause geopolitical friction today. The food cultures of the world were scrambled and redistributed. Chili peppers went to India, vanilla went to France, cacao went to Spain. The global pantry was born from this violent era of spice hunting. And perhaps most remarkably, the spices themselves are still with us, now so cheap and ubiquitous that nobody thinks twice about them. The nutmeg in your kitchen cabinet, the cinnamon in your morning coffee, the black pepper on your dinner table, each one of those jars represents a centuries-long chain of exploration, exploitation, innovation, and revolution. They cost less than $5. They once cost civilizations. The next time you reach for pepper, understand that you are holding something empires collapsed over. The flavor in your hand rewired the world. Before you go, if you learned something valuable today, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Flavor Vault for a brand new video every single day. We will see you in the next one.